Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Cattle HQ Live, a webinar series brought to you by South Dakota State University Extension. My name is Erin DeHaan, one of our co-hosts for the Cattle HQ Live series. Today with us, we have Dr. Hector Menendez, SDSU Extension Livestock Grazing Specialist, and Sara Bauders, an SDSU Extension Forage Field Specialist, discussing how to monitor range conditions and annual forage considerations. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please type them into our Q&A or chat feature, and we will address them at the end. Without further ado, though, I'll turn things over to Dr. Menendez and let him discuss what he has for us today.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you guys hear me okay? And see the screen?
Yep, we're good, Hector.
Thanks, Erin, or thanks, Dr. DeHaan. Yeah, so it's a pleasure to be here today. Going to keep it pretty light, a lot of resources, and hopefully that will generate some good questions. And hopefully this is a different take on grazing management than you may normally hear. So I hope it provokes some good thoughts. Okay, so I'm located in Rapid City. If you need to get a hold of me, that's where I'm located. But yeah, let's jump right in. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, the systems perspective. And the question I want to pose is, are we, and that's we as in you, and maybe my students are running a stocking trial this summer, are you always subject to external forces? And what do I mean by external forces? You can see from this diagram that I put together, dynamic rangelands, there's a lot going on with how animals interact with the grass, or there's grazing pressure and nutrient cycling. But as a big topic is always during these kind of drier winters, fall, winter, and spring is, climate. So do we always have to be subject to those pressures? And so I hope we can explore that a little bit more as we go through. And in those two ways of looking at it, be one, grazing readiness that it will excuse me, that will cover, and then stocking rate. And so a slide that I like, even though this isn't totally a precision livestock technology class, you can envision yourself here as the rancher, or ranch manager, ranch hand, and we're often with these dominoes trying to solve problems. But those management interventions or decisions, especially in biological systems like cattle, where you're hopefully maintaining that cow for a certain number of years, or managing that range across decades, or maybe it's inherited from the family and there's that land use legacy, it has cascading effects over time. And those decisions from year to year in terms of forage production, cattle health, grazing management are really hard to account for because they're delayed in time. And so with that, there's this iceberg diagram. And so during years like this, where we're maybe halfway concerned for half the state about forage production in terms of pounds per acre, we see those kind of things, and it's often highlighted in the news and media. But really, where I'd like to ask you or pose this question is, are there trends over time where your ranch has had to destock or restock cattle inventory, or decrease grazing pressure or increase grazing pressure? And have there been sort of those persistent challenges, not just within 1 year, but across years? And often that's what's going on below the tip of the iceberg. And then we can ask ourselves, and this is where we're going to dive in with our examples, what's really driving this behavior? Is it solely external forces like climate and the sun that you can't control? Or there's some tools and management strategies that you could devise to, or implement, I should say, to be able to influence those trends over time. And often the highest leverage within a system is our mental models, or how we perceive. And so I hope today we can kind of give you a new lens and some examples to maybe shift your mental models of how you view livestock grazing systems, especially before spring turnout. And so in case you want to know more about what mental models are, if you look at this diagram and you're seeing a white triangle, the mental models are deeply embedded beliefs about how the world works, whether that's your family or grazing systems or driving a car. And so if you see the white triangle, your brain is inferring based on the other shapes that it's there. And so that's just an example, an illustration of deeply embedded mental models. And so with that, just going to give you a hope and a fear example. So on the x-axis, time, so just over, it could be, let's say, decades or years, maybe 10 years. We could have things like herd inventory that we want to measure from low to high, or forage production from low to high. And so following this blue line, and I don't know if y'all can see my mouse, but I'm following this blue line. We hope that, you know, we're at this like state where we're okay on forage production, but maybe we can do some things that will increase it over time. And yeah, there might be some climatic variation from year to year, but in general, we're at a more pounds per acre in general with whatever, you know, moving our ranch to that new state. And a fear could be that we try to do some things, or we kind of overgraze, and then it really hurts the system, or maybe we destock and it's really hard to shift the system back up over time. We see this continual erosion. And why I bring this up is because these increases with the first part of the curve and the blue line, or the kind of cascading effect of this red line, are caused by that structure that I mentioned in the iceberg diagram. And so with that, we'll talk about two things that maybe drive some of these changes towards those different states of the rangeland. And so one is grazing readiness. And I'm going to, for this talk, we're going to go over crested wheatgrass, and actually this should be western wheatgrass, but they're both on the tool I'm going to show you developed. But this is an example on the left-hand side of that C3 cool season grass, the state grass of South Dakota, right? And so I had students last year go out and measure in May, and even in April, I just don't show them here, all the way through the growing season of this different leaf stage. And so these leaf stages, as many of you may know, is related to being able to turn out and not harm that grass. And so once we're past that 3.5 leaf stage, then the chance of damaging the grass greatly reduces. And so it's one key metric, and you can just see that illustrated here with moving from that lower leaf stage to the higher leaf stage with that western wheatgrass on the left. And those were taken at the Cottonwood Field Station. Here's one, and I think this is in July 11th. And so you can see that that's a little bit taller western wheatgrass plant with more actual leaf components to it. And then, of course, last year we had the rain. There's just anecdotally an example. That rain really just shut off, and compared to 2023, where it was actually green in 2023, even in August, once that rain just shuts off, which we're going to talk about, and you guys know, you know, that grass nutrient composition changes and just really went into dormancy. So here's one example of a grazing readiness tool. You may or may not have seen this. It was developed by Dr. Jamie Brennan, who's also here at the West River Ag Center and in the Department of Animal Science. And so I just want to go through this quickly, and you'll note here that I put a bunch of QR codes for all this great work. So I'll be sharing this with Dr. DeHaan, and feel free to use these great extension resources that you can leverage to make these kind of informed decisions. So we have the map of South Dakota with different pixels, so these little squares that you can see here. And I'm going to just zoom in here. And so what this is showing us for cool season and warm season grasses in South Dakota is different turnout dates. So when does it hit that 3.5 leaf stage? And so we can see here for the early output, and you can just click this on the actual website, and the SDSU extension website, is that the earliest date we can see for Rapid City, where I'm at here in the mountains, well, that's June 14th. But if we go over here to the, you know, by Yankton, then yeah, we're actually June 4th, so about 10 days earlier. And so these are based on 40-year averages. And so you can use that tool to determine the average. If you say, well, this has been a really warm year or a really cool year, then you can kind of make that judgment, or use the average date here in the middle for those areas. And so just another example of that going forward is, here's the same map, but excuse me, this is with a Cornell tool, and I just figured that this might help illustrate that same principle of this map differently. So when we start in January, what the plants are accumulating are called growing degree days or heat units. And those heat units are based off of how much accumulated heat or energy that plant needs to receive to be able to move through different phases of production. So from green up to that early leaf stage to maturity to having seed production or investing in the roots, depending on the kind of strategy of that plant, if it's perennial or annual. And so we just see that over time. And I put this 1170, which is for Western wheatgrass. And we can see, yeah, in Brookings, I ran this today, that we've already hit the target, or we're about to hit it in Brookings. And so that would indicate that we're able to turn out without damaging that grass. And so this is, when I share this, there's a live hyperlink. And then just going into some growing degree day implications on nutrient dynamics. So, we can turn out. We know that the grass hopefully is young and lush and has a low, high crude protein and low fiber. And so we can see here with TDN being from this NRCS publication, this is an example of a Western wheatgrass variety that, yeah, it's a 70% TDN, which is really good. And that's associated with that 2.5 leaf stage. But then as we move to the boot or seed getting hard and further on towards senescence, then we see that decreasing drought, which means our animals are just their average daily gain, and that performance is going to be decreasing over time. And so relative to how far our precipitation and heat has pushed those grasses, we're already going to come in at a different nutrient stage depending on the year. So that's just another thing to consider, especially with those young growing animals. Another component is toxic plants. So if we do have a year where there's early maturing or early senescence, then there's an opportunistic opportunity for plants like this field pennycress that's semi-toxic, maybe more toxic to horses. You can go check out the article I wrote here. But we saw a lot of that during those drought years in 2022. And then there were some haying considerations as well. And so just being aware of those different trade-offs when there's less of an opportunity for those C3 or C4 grasses that are desirable, like that Western wheatgrass or buffalo or blue grama coming in the warm season grasses to actually have dominance in the field. And so just wanted to point out that we saw a lot of that, and that might be a management concern. So moving forward, and I want to give Laura Edwards, our state climatologist, and Kaylee Wheeler credit, because I just took these off their wonderful extension articles. So we can see this updated May precipitation. And so we see this, below normal. It's about half the state, according to that monthly precipitation outlook. And then something I really like that Kaylee pointed out from Dr. Alexander Smart, or Sandy, as many of you may know him, his work is that, historically, if we don't receive rain in these 3 months, that really not a lot's going to happen. For example, in Cottonwood, 2 years ago, we received a lot of July rain, but it did absolutely nothing for forage production. And so again, that we're going to start linking this to those stocking rates, but that might influence our decisions, proactively deciding what that's going to look like. And there are a lot of great tools or resources to give us a picture of what that might look like. And although I don't have it cited here, I believe Dr. Brennan has a suite of tools made for producers to kind of automate this for your ranch. So you might reach out to Dr. Jamie Brennan about those opportunities with the tools that he's developed. Here is the normal forage production. So from the, excuse me, from the USDA NRCS. And so we can see that the red and being 70% of normal in those drought conditions, and then the green being the normal forage production. And so allow me to move us forward with the projection that this same website presents. And so yeah, it looks like it gets a little bit better, but this is not necessarily for me to tell you this for the obvious reasons, but we can use tools like this to say, well, is it projected to be a percent of normal, and how might that influence our stocking rates or our management considerations for the range? For example, a take half, leave half program. and really that amount of use or percent of use that the animals are going to consume versus the percent that we're leaving on there to capture things like snowpack, to reduce surface soil temperature, and just to have some residual forage there. And so moving into stocking rate, just a few concrete examples. This is the Cottonwood Field Station located by Wall, South Dakota. And we see here, this is from 2022. The picture on the left, it's a group of producers, and it was during one of those really dry years in 22. And we estimated this forage at 490 pounds in our heavily stocked pastures, which have been in the same production setting for about 80 years. Our medium or moderately grazed was 921 pounds per acre, and then our lightly grazed was 1165. Now we can see on the right-hand side, and allow me to orient you, those same heavy, medium, and lightly grazed pastures, but we see that that heavy graze had the lowest amount of soil water at a 45 centimeter depth. And so we were able to, or sorry, 24 inches there, thinking in centimeters here. So we see that the production's different, and that's directly correlated to how much those can, how much the water holding capacity is over, this was from March until May, just for example. And so using these numbers, we can go and we can use a grazing calculator, and there's a QR link here for this grazing calculator developed by Krista Ehlert and Jamie Brennan. And so I put those numbers in here, that 490 pounds and 1165 pounds per acre on a 74 acre pasture. So there's our production. And we can see just by the difference of that production, which is intuitive, right? That it's half the number if we have that, about 500 pounds per acre of cattle that you can put on that specific piece of land for that given time, which was denoted as, or I put as 90 days. And so there we can run this scenario using that tool. And so if you have these kind of estimates, or use there's several different clip plots or height measurements that you can do, kind of a quick and dirty measurement of biomass production, which we're happy to provide training, anybody at the animal science or range team, then you can kind of get a ballpark. And so moving to our next example for how many days. So the calculator also has a function where you can ask not just how many animals, but tell it, well, I want to have 21 animals, and then how many days can I be in there? So same scenario, but then the total days in pasture is 23. And then for the 500 pounds per acre, that lower production yield, and then the 1165 gave us up about 54. So it's about 31 days. And so that's about a 1 month difference depending on production. Let's go to our next example here, and just wrapping it up to hand it over to Sarah is published a study. I think this was in 23. It doesn't really matter. There's a QR code there, but I asked the question, I talked to, some of you may remember Roger Gates, the question of what about, those animals are changing. So a lot of these stocking rates are based off an initial weight, but those animals are growing for that 90-day period, or however long we have them out on a certain pasture, assuming they're young growing animals versus a mature cow herd. And so what I did is I actually took the initial weight, and we see that here on the top row. And so I calculated that with an initial weight, and then the bottom row, with 61 days in pasture, is using an average estimated mid-season weight, which actually reduces our days in pasture by 1 week. And you might say, oh, that makes the difference. Well, last year we came down to 2 days away from being out of grass according to our experimental design. And so depending on your management intensity and goals, that 1 week might make a difference for overgrazing or not. So just summing up here, and again, I want to give Kaylee the credit because this was really well done. Some things are, what are your current weather outlooks? I pointed out those tools. Are there alternative feeding strategies, grazing cover crops, corn residues? So Sarah, I think, is going to touch on annual forages. And then do you have culling or destocking strategies? So those are just some things to consider. And one way you can conceptualize that is, well, if I have a problem, with my profitability or cost, and we're just going to ease into a little heavier stocking rate or extending that stocking rate, a little extending that grazing time a little bit more and putting a little bit more pressure on the grass, or the inverse that you decide to pull off, those have intended and unintended consequences that can either damage or promote rangeland resources. And so we just want to be able to account for that, and that will help us get past something I call the capability trap. So weighing these different decisions and these delayed impacts on stocking rate and having those suite of options and tools really helps you to get past this gap where most managers fail, which is maybe you take a little bit of a hit this year knowing that your range or your cattle inventory will be better because you've made those decisions over the long term. So just food for thought there, no pun intended, and that you don't always have to be subject to these external forces, especially if you plot those anticipated behaviors over time, which I encourage you to do. So with that, I'd like to just share my contact information and hand it over to Sarah. And thank you for your time today.
So my name's Sara Bauders, and as mentioned, I'm the forage field specialist for SDSU Extension. And today it's kind of hard to follow Hector because that was some really good info, Hector, and some good things to think about. But I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can mitigate drought with annual forages and cover crops and what are some options. A lot of times by the time people call me, they're kind of in a pinch and they're trying to figure out, okay, either your cash crop is failing, you don't have enough pasture or range for the year, or your planned your plans just fell through basically, and you're at plan B because of the weather or other factors. So I'm going to give a little bit of a quick outline on different cover crops and what options you have and how they work together. And then I'll get into specifics on what's best in drought toward the end. And I apologize if we glitch throughout here. Right when you turned it over to me, I was having a fight with my PowerPoint. So we'll see how it goes. All right, so annual forages or cover crops, they kind of go by both names. I always say that they're trendy, right? There's this trend for cover crops, but what are some of the reasons why? So the big thing is soil health and ground cover. That's one of the big reasons we see people moving this direction. But in this case, in a lot of cases, it's forages. So we're trying to extend the grazing season, or we're just trying to offer more supplemental forage. We can also do things like increase water infiltration, reduce compaction, erosion, weed suppression. There's some cover crops that are great with weed suppression. You get the nutrient cycling, so you can scavenge the nutrients you leave out there if you're in a annual crop system. And then, of course, it adds diversity, so you're adding soil microbiological activity, and you get additional forage options that you wouldn't typically have. I always like this picture. We call it the tighty-whitey exercise. So you take a pair of cotton, 100% cotton underwear. Anything 100% cotton works, but it's more fun with a pair of underwear, and you bury them for a certain amount of time and then go get them out of the soil, and you can see how much microbiological activity is in your soil based on how much of that cotton has disappeared. So it's kind of a fun project, and we've done it a few times with different soil types and different systems, and you can see a huge difference actually in what's living in that soil. It's a great visual. So a few things to consider with cover crops. I always just want to lay this out at the beginning. Any annual forage or cover crop, especially those you're not used to or didn't intend on, you want to make sure you're looking at herbicide history, insurance, and FSA rules. Those are both big ones. Herbicide history, especially like if you're a little further east and you had soybeans this year and they failed, or soybeans last year and they failed at any given time, or just soybeans, and you sprayed them with a typical soybean herbicide like fomasafen, for example. The rotation restriction on a lot of those is over a year, like 18 months, I believe it is on fomasafen for oats and a lot of grass crops. So you really have to pay attention to that and look back if you've already, put something down that might be a factor. Of course, purpose, you always want to begin with the end in mind, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go on. Seed availability can be a big one from year to year. I haven't heard anything major this year, but some years, because a lot of our annual forage seeds come from the coast, like Oregon area, and then some are more local to the central US, but they come from places further away from here with different climate systems. And sometimes we're just not aware of the fact that they are having an issue that maybe we're not experiencing, and that we then have a seed shortage. So we just have to pay attention to the price and what's available before we make a plan and really set it in stone. Crop rotation, we typically try to do our best to do a primary grass followed by a broadleaf or vice versa. And we try to flip-flop those cool season and warm season species as well to keep a good rotation in that helps with pests and soil health and just a lot of factors. I say primarily because when we do cover crop cocktail mixes, we're going to have differences. We're going to have some of both, right? Sometimes in our mixes, whether that's grass and broadleaves or sometimes even warm and cool season crops together. So we want to make sure that our primary crop is a rotation as best we can. Termination is a big thing that gets overlooked. Make sure that if you put in a crop, you know how you're going to terminate it, especially if it's a winter annual. We don't want it taking up moisture the following spring if it's already dry. Weed control, if you're putting in a mixture that has both grass and broadleaves, it's going to be pretty much impossible to spray most of the time. So we really need to make sure that we're putting in mixtures that are not going into extremely weedy fields. We want to make sure that we've taken care of the weeds beforehand. Now, if you're, say, filling in a dead spot in a pasture temporarily until you can put your perennial back in, that might be a little different situation. But if you're putting in a large area that was in cash crop, you just need to make sure you're not drilling into a whole bunch of weeds that are going to get ahead of the cover because you really don't have any great control outside of grazing it. Soil fertility, this is a tough one in drought years. If you're putting something in specifically for forage, especially if it's a grass, a lot of times it helps to put a low rate of nitrogen, like 30 to 50, 60 pounds. But if it's dry, you risk nitrate issues. So basically too much uptake in the leaves, and then you're going to have nitrate toxicity issues with your animals. So you really have to consider the outlook and being careful with that nitrogen as you put it down. If you do put nitrogen down and it continues to be dry, you should likely take a nitrate test before you turn anything out or hay that, whatever your intentions are. And we do offer a quick nitrate test through SDSU extension that can just, it basically gives you a yes, no. It's not a quantitative test, it's qualitative, but if we get yes, there's nitrates there, then we can send it into a lab and go from there. Also, planting timing is a big one. I will get into more specifics on that later. And then, of course, there's all sorts of things that everybody, depending on their operation, might have things to consider, like timing, field traffic, how much is going to regrow if I graze it, things like that. So there's just a lot of things to consider, especially if you haven't done this before. Okay, I'm just going to breeze through the basics of cover crops and annual forages. If you're not familiar, I basically just have tables here. And I just want to go through what's a cool season, what's a warm season, broadleaf and grass options that we commonly see in our basic region of the country. So cool season broadleaves that we can typically get a hold of are listed here. In my picture there, I've got Alsite clover, some hairy vetch, and then a forage radish. And those are pretty common things we see people put in, and you'll see them around. But this is just a quick list. You hopefully can all see that okay. I'm not going to read through it, but I do have articles out with this info in them as well. So if you want, we can follow up afterward. All right, and then a little bit more on cool season broadleaves, things to consider when we're picking these out if we decide to go this route. Is it a legume or not? So there's quite a few on here that are not legumes, but things like peas, clovers, lentils, those are legumes that are going to fix nitrogen. So that's one thing to consider. That's a benefit. There's a huge diversity though in seeds here. Your seed size is different. That's important if we're making a mix so that we can figure out how to set our drill. If we have a vastly different seed size, we kind of have to compromise on how things are set. And sometimes keeping these mixes in concentration in solution in our drill can be a problem. So we want to make sure that we're able to keep them in solution. And there are a few options of inert matter we can add to make sure that happens, but that is one important thing. Salinity tolerance is a big one. There's a few, excuse me, there's a few on this list that are really pretty helpful with saline issues. Sugar beets are very forgiving and they do pretty well with salt issues, flax, especially when we have high soluble salts, flax can be very beneficial in areas like that. And then another thing we can try is salt tolerant alfalfa. Now, none of these are perfect. They're probably not going to grow as well as that foxtail barley does out there. But if we're trying to get something going in an issue that has salinity, in an area that has salinity issues, those three might be options to consider. And typically they'll start on the edge, they'll start growing if it's a really hot area, and they'll creep their way in. Tolerance of poorly drained soil is another one. You really just have to watch because there's a lot of different options here and which ones are going to do best in my dry or wet soil. And even if it's a dry year, if you've got some soils that once it rains are really going to hold on to things, there's things to consider. And then winter hardiness, what's going to more likely to overwinter than others. They work well when they're planted in the fall because these are cool season crops prior to a warm season cash crop. You can also plant them in the early spring or springtime. Getting a little late now with our hot temps, but you could still, several of these are still planted this time of year, but typically in a mix. So when we look at cool season broadleaves, a big thing we hear about is brassicas. Brassicas are like radish, rapeseed, turnip, things like that, those tuber type plants. And there's some major positives to brassicas. I'd say one of them is that you can get a hold of the seed and it's relatively inexpensive, but also they put on good fall growth. They have a lot of biomass. They're quite high in water concentration. They're nutrient scavengers, so they're good at picking up what's left behind. They help with pest management typically because they're much different than most of the crops and grasses grown natively or put in as annual cash crops in South Dakota. They're great for breaking up compaction for the most part, pretty winter hardy. If you pay attention when we see crops die in the winter, a lot of times the last survivors out there are those brassicas. And they decompose quickly. That is a concern a lot of producers have who aren't familiar with them. They think they're going to stay hard and they worry about them what's going to happen the next spring, but they decompose. They do stink when they decompose, but they decompose and just turn into mush. You won't even know they're there next year. Few drawbacks though. They don't like poor drainage and they have high sulfur and nitrogen uptake. So not only are they going to take up those nutrients, which is helpful if you're going to leave it there, but in this case, if we're using it for forage, we really have to watch for livestock toxicity issues. Blind staggers can be a problem. There's some sloughing issues that can happen. We really have to watch brassicas in the mix and not have them too heavy. Now, we hear of people that put cattle out on straight brassica mixes, but I advise against that. There are major risks with that. So you want to put some grass in there. They can choke out other species. They've got wide leaves, so it can happen. They're sensitive to herbicide carryover, definitely have to watch that. And they can be tough to kill because they're winter hardy, but typically by the end of the winter, they're going to die. It's just an issue of whether they bolted and put on seed, and then you're going to have reoccurring. But once you put on the right herbicide, it's not usually a problem. Moving into cool season grasses. These are the common cool season grasses we see people put in this neck of the woods all the way out way far west. Most of these will go. And they're usually pretty accessible, pretty tough, and generally pretty good nutrient scavengers. Grasses in general are pretty good about that. They're best planted prior to warm season broadleaves if we're trying to keep a good rotation. But these are more common. Most people are pretty familiar with most of the grasses on this list. So moving into warm season options, as it warms up here, we want to think about, okay, what could we put in for a warm season crop? Here are the broadleaf and grass crops that we commonly can get a hold of. I'm not saying these are all inclusive lists, but just some of the common options. And one thing you'll notice is that there's a lot fewer than the cool season. South Dakota is a pretty good cool season growing environment. We don't have enough warm season months, it seems like, but there are still some crops we can get a hold of. And when we talk about the warm season broadleaves, you've got legumes versus non-legumes again to consider. So things like cowpeas or soybeans, those are going to be legumes, but we have others that aren't. They have a little more fibrous roots typically, and they're going to work pretty well when they're planted from June to early August. It's just warm enough by then. This is on a typical year. Granted, every year it's different and our weather's a little crazy, but they like it warm. So if you plant them in August, they'll still take off and go, but keep in mind that the nighttime temperatures are getting lower and longer in the fall. So they're not going to get the time to grow like they would if you plant them early in the year, but it's still an option. Then when we talk about warm season grasses, they're usually a little bit taller than a lot of the grasses we think about. They're going to provide shade. So if they're in a mix, they may shade out other crops, but if we're grazing, sometimes people really like that. You can just about lose animals in them, but you find them. They're good for weed suppression because of that shade. They can be pretty high in nutrients. Again, we have to watch the nitrates, but grasses, you know, age old thing to graze, right? So there's reasons for that. There are a few prussic acid concerns with our warm season grasses, especially when we talk about sorghum, Sudan grass, and sorghum Sudan hybrids, even millet after a freeze. So we really have to watch the prussic acid. When basically what happens is when there is a freeze, there's a chemical reaction that occurs, and when that plant tries to regrow, or if it's just nipped a little bit, there can be high prussic acid there, and that can cause levels of toxicity that can cause death in cattle and other animals. So we really want to watch that. But that's something to consider in the fall. Does not mean you can't graze them or can't grow them. It just means you really need to think about that when it comes time for a freeze, whether you just pull the cattle off and then wait the 2-week period and put them back on, or you watch for it. And really that depends on their maturity, the climate, fertility. There's quite a few factors there. So when we talk about these annual forages or cover crops in general, we want to begin with the end in mind. So why are you seeding this crop is a big question I ask people. In this case, most of you are going to say forages. It's dry, I need more forage. But you can probably pick another 1 or 2 purposes because there's a lot of things we can do because there's so many options and focus on. So maybe you just want to cover the soil more because it's dry and it's blowing and it's windy. So you're working on soil erosion. Maybe it's something else, but definitely make sure you know your why, and that's going to help you pick the right mix. And remember the big picture, right? In a drought situation, that's not usually an issue, but on a year when someone's maybe just putting in a warm season crop and trying it for grazing or for haying, then we really want to keep that in mind. Planting time is a big thing that is sometimes overlooked, to be completely honest. Make sure that you are beginning with the end in mind. So we want to make sure we get our planting timing properly done. I have been a part of many a conversation where someone just simply did not realize that they planted the crop at the wrong time, and that's why it failed or didn't do as well as it should have. So cool seasons, they like it cool. We can plant them in the spring, or we can plant them late July to early August. And the reason, late July, people say, Sarah, that's really warm yet. Yes, it is. But the nights are getting longer and cooler. And so typically that's just enough to get them going. So if you've got some moisture, get them in at the end of July or early August, and that will give them enough time to really grow and give you something to graze by September, hopefully, if the weather cooperates. Warm seasons, typically by June 1st, it's warm enough. I mean, we're planting corn in April, right? So of course, these are rough guidelines, but when we're talking forages, this is kind of the best scenario given an average year. That those planting times should give you enough forage out of that crop for that year if you get enough moisture. So there's a lot of factors to consider because some people will mix the two together and you have some forgiveness on those dates. But generally speaking, if it's primarily one or the other, those are the dates you want to kind of strive to hit. So there's a few options when we talk specific to drought. So pending precipitation, generally you don't want to put anything out there until you know there's some moisture coming if you got no moisture in that first couple inches. Warm season blends are ideal in the summer. I was literally just on the phone with someone talking about hay millet. Hay millet is an option because it's very forgiving in dry soils. It provides great erosion control rather than watching your soil blow across the field. And it's a good forage producer. It's pretty tough. It handles things well. So hay millet is always, I shouldn't say always, hay millet is typically accessible as well and doesn't necessarily cost a fortune. So that's pretty popular. Forage sorghum is another one that does very well in dry weather and it can produce similar to corn. So probably not as much necessarily this crowd, but when I'm talking to the dairy folks, if they have needs for silage or a corn crop failure, forage sorghum is a close second and has actually close nutrient values to corn as well. You have to supplement a little bit, but it is tough and it's a good producer. One thing about forage sorghum though, you can graze it, but haying it's pretty tough. Keep that in mind. Sudan grass is another one similar to forage sorghum, excuse me, sorghum Sudan hybrids. Tough grass is an option, can sometimes be hard to get established, but it has a very small seed, so it's a little more forgiving of, you know, depending on if you have just a light rain, that's maybe enough to get tough grass going, where if it's not enough to get down to the soil for a bigger seed, that can help. However, it's very picky like alfalfa with seed to soil contact. So sometimes it's tough to get going. Flax is another good option if you want a broadleaf in your mix. And one cool thing about flax is it does awesome things with soil microbiology. So that's something to consider if that's one of your goals. So millets are common. I always like to cover them a little bit. So millets are a quick cover. They grow relatively quickly if they get enough moisture to get going. And there's three pretty common ones that we see people put in. Foxtail and proso, they both have a nice fine stem, so you could graze or hay them. Japanese millet, also popular, but it requires a little more moisture to get going, so in a dry year might not be the best option. Heavy tonnage, but might not get going for you. Dry conditions though, usually pearl millet, it has a little more production potential, but it does have a coarser stem. So for haying, that's something to weigh for sure. But proso and foxtail also do well under dry conditions. And if you really want to maximize biomass, if we're really going after tonnage, pearl millet's probably the best option. But again, just keep in mind it has a coarser stem. It's maybe not quite as palatable. You have to watch it closely so it doesn't get too mature and unpalatable. So if we wait till fall, if you can get your way through the summer here, and in the fall you want to extend your grazing season or just have more forage on hand, there's some low water using broadleaves we can consider. Probably the number one I'd suggest is field pea, but other options that are good are clover, chickling vetch, and lentil. And then grass options, the bolded ones here are probably the best, but any of these could work. So forage oat, keep in mind that it's going to winter kill for you on its own, and forage barley will do the same thing. Get the onless barley, especially if you're grazing, you don't want anybody getting pink eye or other issues with awns and lump jaw and things like that. And then winter wheat, of course, it's going to overwinter. So keep that in mind. If you want cover there in the spring, great. If you want to maybe graze it in the spring, great. But it is going to be taking up moisture in the spring. At winter rye, same thing, going to overwinter. Keep in mind. And don't grow it on the same farm as wheat. So if you grow wheat, don't grow rye. Seed contamination issues there. Winter triticale is another one. That's a cross between wheat and rye. That can also be a good fall forage option. So a couple things to consider if you're transitioning cattle. Now, granted, if you know this, just ignore me for a minute here, but this is important if you are not used to grazing some of these crops that I'm talking about. So there are concerns on dry years that can come up. Nitrates building up are a big one. That's why I suggest nitrate testing, especially grasses, before you turn anything out. Sulfur buildup, especially with brassicas. So we want to make sure we have enough grass in that mix. And moving cattle from a dry pasture to high protein covers, that's a pretty big shock. So what can we do about these things? There's just a few tips to consider. Don't turn out animals hungry. I think most people are pretty good about this, but sometimes we get lost in all the planning of moving cattle and we don't think about it. So make sure they're good and fed before you turn them out. If you can, if it's an option, you can try to introduce them slowly. So put them out for a few hours a day, bring them back type of thing. Or you can fence off a small area so you can limit their intake. But that's going to be more like a mob graze situation. It just depends on if that's even available to you. Providing dry matter while they're grazing can help. So putting a bale of whatever they're used to out there, like a dry grass out there, can be helpful so that they'll maybe limit some of their intake on the new stuff because it's new and they're not familiar with it, if that's the case. We always suggest that the mix is at least 25% grass. That's going to help with some of these issues. And if they're not familiar with covers, they often go to the thing that, it's like a little kid. They're not familiar with the food and you have a food they're familiar with on their plate. They're going to eat the food they're familiar with first, right? At least mine will. So they'll eat the grasses out there first. They'll eat the oats before they're going to eat the brassica if they're not familiar with covers. And then again, you can test those grasses for nitrates if it's dry. So just a couple last things here. For forage quality, this is just a table I pulled from NRCS, and These mixes were planted after wheat harvest. Just gives you a little bit of an idea of, generally speaking, how we see forage quality go. So if you have a cool season mix versus a warm season mix, and this was warm season grasses, the crude protein is going to be a little higher with the cool season, and the RFB is going to be a little higher. But if you look at production, our warm season grasses, a lot of them are more native too, are going to be higher producing, and we're going to have an earlier quality peak with the warm season grasses. Cool season mix is going to peak later in the year in the fall, unless planted early in the spring, of course. So just consider that when you're making these decisions, like what time do I want to be grazing or haying? What's more important to me, the quality or the tonnage? And I know a lot of folks with beef will say, well, tonnage every time, but quality matters. It still matters. They may not be dairy animals, but the quality certainly matters. So a quick overview, get your soils covered. If it's dry and windy, that's really important. I know you need the additional forage, and this is one way we can do it. So we can add the forage with pending precipitation, of course, to get it started, and it helps get your soils covered so they're not blowing away on you. Be sure to think about those turnout tips. Consider early action next spring, and you can talk with us, myself. There's several of us with SDSU Extension that can help with a cover crop grazing mix if you're interested, or NRCS conservation districts. They all have folks in them typically that can assist you, because it can be really overwhelming if you're getting started with this the first time. Here's some resources that are great. The NRCS cover crop page for South Dakota is fantastic and has just a lot of good information in it. There's a spreadsheet you can use to make a mix. There's even some recommended options for mixes that can really help. That's what this screenshot is here. And then MCCC is the Midwest Cover Crop Council. They also have some great tools for our area that you can use to try to make a mix or make some of these decisions. This is my contact information and my why. That's my family. That's why I do what I do, and we farm as well. So I've got some skin in the game, and I definitely care about the people I work with. So thanks for having me today, Hector and Aaron, and I'll take any questions.
Yeah, thank you both, Hector and Sarah, for discussing some really vital information about tools to both use for monitoring grazing readiness on our rangelands, as well as then thanks, Sarah, for a lot of good information about some of our annual forages. We'll now go into our discussion portion of our program. I don't see any questions right away, so I'll go ahead and get things started with while we wait for those questions to come in. First at Hector. So we've got some recent moisture here throughout the state, and are going to should be getting some here with it over the weekend and early into next week. So it might be hard for producers to consider, holding pairs back before they kick them out to grass, or, it can be even hard we're going into drought, but it can be hard for some producers to really accept that at this time. But what are some other things? It could be stuff you mentioned, but what should producers be continuing to do prior to turnout and then throughout the grazing season, and different time points that they should be, paying attention to for monitoring their rangeland?
Yeah, thanks, Aaron, for a great question. It's really actually fun, and there's some easy ways to do two key things. Is while they're kind of juggling making those decisions, and I totally understand. Yeah, you got to get the animals out there. Maybe you're low on hay or whatever the situation is. Keep an eye on that weather, and again, that April, May, and June. If any of the precip or anything is going to happen, that's the window to cause growth for our peak biomass. And then after that, it becomes clearer and clearer. So they can keep monitoring that, and those percent forage production maps that I put the links up on there. And those are just really good indicators as a rule of thumb to say, well, should I be concerned about this? Should I keep this option as a question that I might want to more seriously consider? Because as you get further towards June, the likelihood of getting those precipitation events drastically decreases. So that's kind of a good hard stop for producers to just keep relative to their production goals. And maybe you do take that risk, and then the second one is the forage rangeland assessment and monitoring. Clipping plots takes a long time. We go out and clip at a 1/4 of an inch height. And then we dry the forage. And so their SDSU has rangeland sticks with a rule, or the South Dakota Grassland Coalition will provide them for free, and I believe. And so just going out there doing a quick and dirty measurement to just get some data to say, well, what is it? Because often what we perceive and what's actually out there are two different things. And without data, it's hard to manage. A lot of producers may know their system, but just keeping those simple records. For example, we're going out on May 30th to take an initial biomass estimate. We'll dry that forage down, and then we'll calculate our AUMs and the amount. And our steers are coming in a little heavier this year for our long-term trial. And so we're also factoring in that body weight. So what's the condition of that steer? Because again, that will alter your typical availability to actually meet or exceed those stocking rate limits. So yeah, thanks, Aaron.
Sarah, so you had mentioned that early July producers can start considering to maybe plant some cool season cover crops. I guess what kind of, I guess, how severe of a drought conditions do we need to have for producers to maybe not consider wanting to plant a cool season crop for the fall? Maybe
That's tough. So like late July, early August, we want to make sure. I would wait until like the 3rd week of July probably. But it's kind of hard to say like when the drought monitor says this, because if you're really in need of forage, it's a pretty good option. And we hope by fall, sometimes our weather systems change. Laura, I always say, it's on you. Can you will it to move? She says she can't will the weather, but our state climatologist is great, Laura Edwards. But really, I think that if you can see a little bit of moisture coming, and you're concerned about what you have maybe for hay for the winter, or whatever you have for winter feed, and you're concerned you don't have enough and you didn't have enough going on this year, that's probably the time to consider, okay, what can I put in if I see some moisture coming that's not going to hinder what I'm already doing per se, and provide me enough feed to get through the winter. I mean, another option, of course, is culling herds, that type of thing, but nobody really seems to enjoy doing that. At least we don't. So there is that option of buying forages as well, but typically it can be fairly economical to put in something in the fall. Of course, again, like if it's really dry and you're for sure you want it and you need it, that's when it's going to be hard to get a rain to get it started. But there's no like hard and fast, it's this dry, you should do it. It's going to depend on your situation and what makes the most sense to you, because some of these cover crops or annual forages are not terribly expensive. And so if you can put in, if you're worried about budget, you can put something on the lower budget side, do your rain dance, say a prayer, hope you get it to come up, and then at least you have something covering the soil. I mean, we've had it before where it's failed on us because it was too dry, but we did get something to come up. So at least our topsoil didn't blow away, you know, if it's an annual crop field. So kind of dependent on the situation.
Well, and even, I think you mentioned your June 1 is kind of your target for getting your warm seasons in, want them in by then. Still got a couple weeks before that date. Would you recommend for producers, if they even have a consideration of being short on forages or just on feed, to go ahead and try to get something in the ground?
Yeah, I mean, as long as the outlook is relatively warm. I know where I'm at, I'm kind of in South Central, and like today it's rainy and cold, but I believe it's supposed to warm up again and stay warm. Like I said, we plant corn in April, and you know, it just depends on the germination temperature of the crop, but the warm seasons can be relatively forgiving. June 1 is just a good target because you know it's going to be warm and it's going to do really well for you when it's warm in the summer. But if you want to start planting early because there's rain outlook now and you're concerned there won't be, that's sure something you could try to do. I can't tell you how it's going to turn out, but as long as your soil temps are up to par, you could pull it off.
I think we're getting close to the end of the time. We'll kind of wait a couple more minutes, see if any questions come in.
Krista did mention, Aaron, thanks, Krista, good point. So there's some grazing sticks that come through NRCS, and I think the Soil Health Coalition also offers the same stick. Those are awesome to help you kind of measure what you have out there, or if it's ready to graze, if you should be grazing it, if you're not there yet, things like that. So, and it has a lot of math conversions on it, which is really helpful if you're not into memorizing conversions, like me. Like I like the stick for that reason. There is also a cover crop stick out there, but I always say like use with caution. It's a great tool, but there's such a vast variety of cover crops that it can be a little misleading. So great to use, just to be aware that like none of that is hard and fast every single time blanketed statement. But both of those are great tools.
Well, thanks again to Hector and Sarah for taking the time to speak with us today. If you have specific questions that come up later on for either of our speakers, please feel free to contact them directly. Be sure to check out the SDSU Extension website for our other upcoming Cattle HQ Live events. We do have a brief survey that will be sent out here at the conclusion of this webinar that we ask you to kindly fill out so we can continue to improve our webinar series. But anywho, thanks for everyone who joined today. Greatly appreciate you taking your time to listen in, and see you next time.